Hi, everybody. Nice to see you all. Thank you for coming to the walkthrough. All right, so I'm Taylor, obviously, but so this work, there's two rooms. This entire room is all paintings, all oil on canvas, and the kind of overall kind of arcing concept for the show is this idea of the cover up and what it means to cover something up or obscure it or make it difficult to identify exactly what that might be. So that's a big part of it, is this idea of the cover up. And then the other kind of complementary overarching concept is how the cover up relates to the idea of how we understand value and who and what has value in our society. And a lot of that value, social, monetary, economic, all of that, these different types of value is, in my kind of approach, is related to how we identify people or things. So everything in this show is every object or person is fully covered in fabric or pattern or obscured to a larger extent through the use of the gradient. So some stuff is maybe more recognizable than other forms, but basically the way that I'm making the work, especially the figurative work especially, is I have all these suits. They're originally like those green screen chroma key suits that are like full body, head to toe. I think for like doing movie stuff, I don't know. But basically they have those suits in patterns. So I use these suits and I have people, friends, family, basically whoever's available to model for me. So they start as photographs, and so they are real people in the suits. Their identity, I mean, I know who they are, but the identity is ideally to be anonymous, and this, you can still maybe gain certain things from body language or form. A lot of things, I feel like we're so clued into body language that the viewer can still get a lot from the figure, even though they're basically completely covered head to toe. So the idea behind that, and kind of is a playful critique of this idea within American capitalism of how it champions the individual. It's who you are, like especially now, like what's your brand, what's your website, like normal people need to have a website now for some reason. That's like or someone told me that for like job interviews, so I was like, why do we need web? But anyways, I'm digressing. But so this idea of the form, the figure, very much who you are, being monetized based off of being able to recognize you. And so it's kind of a playful critique of that idea. If you can't be recognized, then you're kind of denying that data collection of who you are, or how you're perceived in society, or what you're linked to with your credit card debt or your mortgage, or all of these things that are so tied to our unique identity. So it's very much a fantasy, but this idea of if you can't be recognized, then you're kind of set free from all of these things. And so that's kind of what these figures are representing. And again, very much a fantasy. So that's kind of how I'm thinking about the figures within this work, is it's this kind of escape from our kind of forced structure of having to promote individualism, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's just as complicated, I think, and very much tied to consumption and American consumerism, which very much champions the individual, which also is the consumer and the buyer. So kind of it has that cascading effect. And then thinking about that in relationship to the vase paintings. So the vase paintings are, all three of them are on this wall, and a couple of things I was thinking about with this is because I'm also really interested in how the consumer, if we're thinking about the human, the individual as this consumer, how we consume objects, what objects do we place value on, and kind of especially within branding and consumption culture, I feel like so much advertising is based off of like very much fetishizing objects, and like we really like, I mean, I attribute like strong emotional feelings to some t-shirt I want, but like the t-shirt doesn't give a shit about me. But so this idea of how much we're like kind of emotionally targeted with objects that are for sale towards us. And so these, the vase paintings I feel like are very sensual, and the hands are kind of caressing these forms that are the gradient kind of, the hands are wrapping around objects that are flattened through the gradient, so the objects are kind of quote unquote empty, or they don't really exist. So it's kind of thinking about that, like what does it mean that we in our current society place so much value on certain brands or certain objects that kind of maybe that value is almost entirely manufactured. And so there's this kind of sensual caress of these objects that aren't really there. And then also the vessel, very much, I mean, a lot of art historical context of the vessel being used, and especially these vessels, I feel like the organic shape feels really related to the form of the figure. So they're these kind of smooth curves that are being held by arms that probably are connected to bodies. But the forms of the vases are kind of related to the feminine form. So again, that kind of how within advertising, there's a lot of kind of fetishizing or sexualizing of the form in order for us to, whatever, be attracted to what we want to get. So that's, and everything is staged in my studio, and then it gets put through Photoshop. And I have a lot of these fabrics in my studio too, so I'm setting up backdrops with fabrics that I collect. And then they just kind of get various degrees of manipulation in Photoshop. So I have a final reference image that I work with for the painting. And I think the other thing is a lot of, like in the same umbrella, a lot of this is like a critique of like predatory data collection, because we're so kind of forced to be online, that so much of who we are and what we want is kind of mined through all of this data collection that we're kind of forced to participate in. And so again, that kind of idea of covering up or obscuring is kind of denying that collection of data. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk about what like the role of paintings are.
Yeah.
Paintings and why that.
Yeah, two things. Number one, I just love painting. I've tried other forms, and it's just like my fave. Like I've really tried to branch out. It's not, I mean, I guess the other room I'm trying, but I just like absolutely love painting, and especially oil painting, and how kind of sensuous and layered it can get. But beyond that, kind of thinking about this idea of value, I feel like in the different genres of art, painting is the one that tends towards being the most commercial too. It's the easiest to put up on a wall, to buy, to put in your home, put in a commercial building. So I feel like this work being painting kind of plays into that same idea of like something that I'm critiquing, I'm also participating in. So I'm like kind of playfully making fun of myself of like I'm critiquing value, but at the same time I'm producing work that is also a product or an object, a commercial object. So it kind of, I'm not taking myself too seriously, hopefully. Like that, I like that idea of that which I'm critiquing I'm also participating in, because I feel like that's really how our society is structured too. It's really hard to opt out if we want to survive or make it or whatever. So we have to use the tools that are available in order to participate. So I feel like that's kind of where painting plays into it for me. Yeah.
I have 2 questions.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so first of all, can you talk about the colors? They're
Yes.
just really gorgeous.
Yeah. Part of it for me is a lot like the first step is kind of just intuitive of what like messing around with color and what I think looks good or complements the other things. So it's partially intuitive, but the other part, like on these same lines of kind of thinking about advertising and consumption of like this same idea that's like ads or Instagram reels or what, like they're like bright and colorful and highly saturated, and so it's like that idea of it drawing you in with that kind of very over the top color. So kind of relating to that idea of like really trying to get your attention to look at the object or the product.
Okay, and then my second question,
Yeah.
just if I understood you correctly, do you see these people as basically having escaped this sort of, like, they've escaped the tie to the digital world? Is that how you see that? Like they are free from it?
That's a good
or
question.
do you see them as being trapped within it?
I don't, that's a really good question. Fuck. Kind of both, honestly. Like temporarily free, but I also feel like there is like, especially the checkered grid feels so related to technology for me. So I think it's kind of maybe, yeah, that really complicated problem of wanting to be free but not necessarily being able to.
Yeah.
Maybe if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's maybe not necessarily one or the other.
So it's not like they're camouflaging themselves from this whole situation. It's not a camouflage.
No, not. I think it's more kind of like taking away the individual identity is the important part, but then it's again only in this brief moment in time where they're posing for the painting or they become the painting. So yeah, maybe that like the idea of a bit of a brief reprieve, but we can't, if we want to survive, we can't really fully escape. Maybe like a vacation, like a 2-week paid vacation or something. Yeah. Yeah.
I guess I wonder, is it important that we see the stroke and the hand of the artist? Because, coming into today,
Yeah.
all I've seen were digital images and they appear very flat.
Yeah.
They're not. And I wondered if that was important or.
Yeah, that's a great question because they aren't. Like you really can see the strokes or where some of like the medium gels up. And I think that that's important because I really like they are very produced by hand. Like I don't like tape stuff off or I just like slowly kind of go through everything. So I do like this idea that you can see the hand of the person making it because they, like, even though I feel like I'm critiquing all these things that are maybe a little bit more digitally based now, like painting is such an analog process. So I like that kind of contrast or juxtaposition of using painting to like think about social media, or like it has a nice kind of opposite ends of the spectrum. So yeah, I think it's intentional that you can see brushstrokes or medium or whatever. Yeah. Yeah.
I think we get a lot of people ask about how things are, like people are
Yeah.
often really obsessed with the technique.
Totally.
And so you mentioned that you basically stage these a little bit
Yeah.
in the studio and then photograph them and then you kind of work them in Photoshop.
Yeah, so I'll stage them with the base ones I have, the background fabrics are fabrics that I have, so I'll like basically have someone, the photos are really funny, but like someone will be just like have their arms in the suit and just be like here, touch the base like this. It's my fiance and he's just like his head's out. He's like holding a vase. So it's photography, and then it's a combination of like setting up sets, like fabric sets behind them, or sampling and photographing fabric and running that through Photoshop. So because when sometimes like I'll want to find patterns or fabrics that I love, but I don't have enough of a budget to do like a full in-person backdrop. So I do a lot of samples too that then get manipulated or blown up in Photoshop. And then the painting process is, I usually do I do a gradient on the figures, like a first whole gradient of color, and then I go in with projection and gridding and do an underdrawing with paint, and then I start painting. And I do a lot of color checking while I'm painting, so I like have the Photoshop image up, because a lot of the times, especially with these ones where the pattern's overlapping, it's really hard to tell what the color actually is versus, because it looks different depending on what it's next to. So it's I have the little eyedropper tool on Photoshop, so I'm like, look at one of the checkers, and like, oh, it's more orange than it looks, and so then I'll mix that color. So it's a lot of checking colors as I'm working.
That's amazing. Is there a reason why you use the floral fabrics and the retro?
I think I just kind of attracted to the retro style is one part of it, but I also think in relation to these vases being kind of bodily or feminine forms, like again pushing that even maybe a little more overtly with floral patterns.
I think I'm going to move us into
Yeah.
studio 2.
Okay, so this room is giving me nightmares. But so basically, like when Jordan and I were talking about developing the work, like I was thinking about using this room as more of an installation room, just because I felt like there was enough paintings already, and I usually like having an installation aspect to my work when I'm doing a show. So I kind of was thinking about this room as the idea of getting inside of the painting. So these vinyl cutouts are the same repeating design that's in all the figurative paintings. So this vinyl is all kind of reflective and light reactive, and so it also, even though it's all the same material, it kind of naturally produces this gradient. And so I was like, this is literally the perfect material to replicate or think about how the paint is working in the paintings, because a lot of the transparent figures in the paintings are about how it's overlaying or changing the color. So I felt like once I stumbled across this material, it was like doing exactly what I wanted it to be doing in relation to the paintings. And it's not as, just because of some installation issues, it's not as mirrored as ideally it would be, but also thinking about this room as a place that's very much activated by the viewer in the same way that those paintings are activated by the figures in them. So when you're walking, your shadow, you can kind of see yourself, or at least your shadow, in the mirrored vinyl. So thinking about in relation to consumption and consumerism, like nothing that we do, or nothing has value, or any, no ad exists without us as humans participating or buying that thing. So this space to me feels like it's really important that the viewer is activating it in that way, as the consumer of art, of whatever. So that's a portion of it. And then the center, there'll be gels on all the lights, so it'll be kind of moody, hopefully. And then I'm collaborating with my friend who's a musician, and she's making a sound install for this room. That's basically, the goal is trying to get this room to feel like you're inside of the paintings and or maybe like inside of the algorithm. And so the sound loop is all these little samples from like TikTok or Instagram, but overlaid with music too, and the music's constantly changing. And so this idea of like really blurring the line between, I don't know, at least when I'm on like Instagram for way too long, like I like get so sucked in and then I look around me, I'm like, okay, I need to go back to the real world. So this room kind of being a space where you're get really caught up in what's going on, but then the music constantly shifting is like ideally kind of making your attention go back and forth between all these different things in the same way that I feel like we are asked to do all the time as participating members of society, but also B, I feel like that's really how social media is working these days, is everything is just like everywhere you look, something's asking for your attention. So the sound install will kind of be this, it'll start like getting really like lulling, but then it'll have something that jolts like or is unexpected. So it's a like a 15-minute sound loop that kind of goes through all sorts of different iterations during it. And then the center of the room will have 5 of these pedestals that are covered in vinyl. And there'll be a bunch of these cast hand sculptures on them, and some of them are holding objects. And so these are kind of referencing the vase paintings a little bit. So having it be not necessarily this room is not necessarily a replication of the paintings, but more so like an extension of them where you're inside of the experience, but not trying to verbatim recreate the painting in 3D. Yeah, I think, am I missing anything?
No, I mean, no, I don't think so. I mean, this wall's going to be painted like a gradient as
Mhm.
well, and there will be wall text here that describes this room. So, maybe that assistance for visitors. Sorry, I don't know.
Yeah.
So what would your, like, for people coming and
Yeah.
checking this out, what would your goal be? Like, what would you want them to leave with?
That's a good question. I feel like when Jordan and I were talking about this, like I feel like I'm not necessarily like presenting a solution to anything because I don't have a solution. But I think it's more like when we were talking on the podcast, like this idea of just awareness around these things and starting to have a conversation about it. And like I think a lot of people do think about this stuff, but I don't know. So I guess maybe this kind of awareness around like ideally like how individual data collection is so pertinent, and like we as the consumer dictate a lot of what is like done unto us too. So I feel like I don't really see a way out of it at this point, or like they make it so like I'm just as willing of a participant. Like I'll talk shit on Amazon, but I have Amazon Prime. Like they make it so easy. So I feel like it's maybe just an awareness around it. These various kind of ways that we're forced to participate in the structure that's been created for us, which is not necessarily entirely bad or entirely good. It's, yeah.
Just bring the awareness.
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, and hopefully just like enjoy the experience of being with the work too.
Okay, I have one more question.
Yeah.
So we were talking, the engagement guys and I were talking
Yeah.
before, and we were imagining that people coming into this room would take selfies.
Yeah,
in front
totally.
of this, and
Yeah.
that it's kind of cool because then they're, literally
Exactly.
putting themselves.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that's part of what you were thinking.
Totally.
as well.
And we were talking about that too, of like this site, like this room, I'm like very aware that it's like very Instagrammable and like take selfies in front of it, which I think is great, because it kind of like what I was like I feel like it does the same thing as like what I'm talking about with the paintings of like I'm critiquing things, but I'm also participating. So I feel like it has that same kind of idea of like I'm critiquing social media, but this room is so social media friendly too. So I feel like it's that like double-edged sort of it. So I think that that's great because I don't have, yeah, I feel like I don't have a problem with that. I think it's more kind of great that it's maybe like poking fun at itself a little bit, but also activating like interaction too.
I feel like it's sort of describing the situation that we're all in.
Right.
We're all like a little bit uncomfortable with the data.
Right.
Not really liking being marketed to, but at the same time
But we do it anyway. Right. Yeah.
A lot of the things that we get.
Right. Right. Exactly.
Strange.
Yeah. That's like the exact way of putting it. Yeah, I like have such a complicated relationship with it, but if I open up Instagram and it shows me a shirt that like is exactly the shirt that I didn't know I want, like that's kind of like it's like this love-hate relationship. Yeah.
Cool.
I think I have one for once.
Questions?
I think I have one for once.
I know it needs to be a party room. Yes. Yeah.
Are we gonna project sound into both rooms or just here?
Just this room. Yeah.
Oh, actually, have you seen what the room looks like at night versus daytime? Like, how does that change?
No, but it is gonna be. I have to mess around with that because I think most of the time there's gonna be no light coming in from the outside, and all the lights will have gels on them. So it probably will stay the same, but I haven't until I try it. Yeah. I hope it works out as I'm imagining.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Questions?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe it's more for, it's going to be open otherwise as